Our next speaker is confused. He was an entrepreneur, then he was a VC, then he was an entrepreneur again, now he's a VC again. And he must be super, super smart because he was CTO at Hulu, and now he's at Kleiner Perkins. With that, I want to welcome Eric. Eric, come on down. So what makes you go back and forth?
Oh man, I guess I really can't make up my mind.
Well, I'm sure you'll have some stories to tell. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you guys very much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day, especially with the gorgeous sunshine outside. It's a great day. I know you're stuck in here with the likes of me, but hopefully you get some time to go outside and enjoy the nice, beautiful weather we have today. So my name's Eric Feng, and very thrilled to be here today. Actually, I don't have a clicker, so I'm gonna like do hand signals, and hopefully the slides will advance. Next slide. Look at that. That's pretty cool, right? So I've had the pleasure of working at a bunch of really awesome companies that I was just really lucky to be a part of. Places like Microsoft and Hulu. I'm now at Kleiner. We're a venture capital firm on Sandia Road that's been around for about 44 years. And at Kleiner, I focus on early stage consumer investing. But the career experiences that I'm actually most proud of are my times as an entrepreneur. So I wanted to share just a couple of quick entrepreneurial stories, and then which will be kind of boring, but then we'll get to really interesting stuff, hopefully, which is really what we're seeing in terms of trends in the tech industry, trends in startups, and things that can hopefully be helpful to all of you as you pursue your entrepreneurial adventure. But quick question before we start. By show of hands, who here is an entrepreneur at a startup, planning to start a company? Nice, I love it. Well, then hopefully some of these stories will resonate, and it'll be a fun, quick session for us together. Next slide. All right, first bullet. So I've had the fortune of starting 3 companies in my time, and was able to sell them all. And the first company I started was back in 1999. It was called UberWorks. We were building some technology that was powering e-commerce sites. And we ended up selling that to a public company called Network Commerce. And I was one of 3 founding engineers on the team, and what I learned from that experience is just how much fun it is to build things. So when I was at UberWorks, they called me the 10-minute guy, because every time there was a problem, I'd say, give it to me, I'll fix it in 10 minutes. And it would never take 10 minutes. It would take probably 10 hours or even 10 days. But the thing that was really exciting about startup was just the irrational confidence and the irrational energy that you have to build things when you're in that startup environment. And I love that. I just learned to really appreciate that. And then the next company I had the fortune of doing was called Mojiti. I actually started this company when I was in China. So it was a small startup in China, and then we were doing online video technology. We ended up selling this company to Hulu. And what I learned from this adventure was how much fun it is to build consumer products. So not to knock anyone in this room that's doing enterprise products. Enterprise products are awesome. But the thing that I think is really special about consumer products is that when you're doing consumer products, you end up designing and building something that your users can have an emotional connection with. And that's really powerful. It's very intoxicating. Before Mojiti, I'd focused a lot actually on the enterprise side. For example, when I was at Microsoft Research, I was looking into new technology around storage engines and query processors, which is fun, but it's not every day when you're kind of walking up down the street and the barista at the local coffee shop tells you how much they love your query processor. And actually at that time, my mother is a IBM DB2 administrator. My father is an Oracle DBA, and I was working on some technology that was going to SQL Server. So we had some of the most boring dinner room conversations ever for the holidays. But contrast that with the experience of Hulu and getting to work with things like people's favorite TV shows and the movies that they love. It was just a very different experience. And I think that's what really makes consumer products special, is that emotional connection that your users can have with the things that you build. And then, next advance. The last company I had the fortune of starting was called Early. And I got to incubate that inside of Kleiner Perkins in 2011. And what I really loved about Early was this process of going from 0 to 1. from just an idea on the back of a napkin or scribbling on a whiteboard and taking that to an actual finished product. So when we started early, we actually didn't even know what we were doing. I was at Kleiner and just knew that I wanted to get back to building. So went about this fun adventure of incubating something inside of Kleiner, working with my partners to figure out what would be an interesting idea, an interesting product area to pursue. Ended up building that and just taking it from that zero conceptual phase to actually a product phase, that one phase. So those are the three lessons that I really take with me every day from my startup adventures. And next slide. I'm fortunate in that now at Kleiner, this is what I do every day. I help great entrepreneurs like all of you out there help take your consumer products from 0 to 1. I focus, I'd say 99% of my time on consumer, and there's other great partners at Kleiner that focus on enterprise and life sciences and different fields, but I try to stick to the consumer side. And again, that early stage, going from 0 to 1. And during the last, I'd say, 6 years that I've been looking at companies either through the lens of an operator at a startup or through the lens of an investor investing in startups, the last 6 years, I think a couple of trends have emerged, and I wanted to focus most of our time today covering those three trends. The first is that anything now can be built faster and cheaper than ever before, and I'll get into some hopefully illustrative examples of why that is. The second is consumer, especially getting consumer traction. It's harder than ever before. I know maybe comes off as woe is me, the guy focusing on consumer stuff. We got it so hard on the consumer space. But I actually do believe that consumer companies are harder than ever before to build. And we'll get into a couple of reasons of why. But finally, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be building startups or you shouldn't be building consumer startups, because there's still a ton of very exciting things that are going on that we should all be pretty energized about. So why don't we get into that first thing? Anything now can be built faster and cheaper than ever before. Next slide. So I love this quote from author Matt Ridley. He wrote this book called The Rational Optimist, and he says, this definition of prosperity: the increase in the amount of goods or services you can earn with the same amount of work. I'll give you an illustrative example of that. So about 200 years ago, if you worked for 1 hour, you toiled in the field, or you actually did your job 200 years ago for 1 hour, you could purchase about 15 minutes of light, because that's how expensive light was. Today, if you work for about an hour, whether you are programming at your desk, you're filing accountant reports, you're waiting tables, you're making coffee, whatever it is you're doing, you work for about an hour, you can purchase enough light for an entire year. Because we are all far more prosperous. We are more prosperous, largely in part due to technology, but that's an example of prosperity. Now, on the product side, we are also much more prosperous as well. I'm going to give you an example of 3 consumer products and measuring them in terms of resources that were spent investing in them, and also in the time that it took to build them. So, first product, Microsoft Word. Back in 2000, it's actually right when I joined Microsoft, I worked on some technology that actually went into Microsoft Word 2000. And back then, this product took about 300 engineers and about 2 years to build. And this was actually considered an excellent, well-run product release schedule. It wasn't that late. It was very buttoned up, on time, on resource. It was a really well-executed product at Microsoft. Fast forward 7 years, Hulu was a product that I actually got to build firsthand. I wrote, maybe about a third of the front-end code of Hulu myself. And that product release, our first version, it took about 30 engineers and only 3 months. Then fast forward to 2010. Here's a little product that I got to look at when I was at Kleiner, and we were scouring great startups to invest in. And I got to meet Kevin and Mikey, and they showed me Instagram, and it took them 3 people and about 6 weeks to build. Just an example of how fast products are getting created and the resource down curve. Now, the thing I didn't put up here is the cost involved. So Microsoft Word, you could measure in hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of the resources that went into that product. Hulu was probably in the single-digit millions, maybe 10 if you added it all up together. And then Instagram is literally, you can measure that in tens of thousands of dollars. in terms of how much cash they had to outlay into building that product. And the key things are, not only is it fast, you can see the time scale is very different, but the cost involved in terms of people and dollars is a fraction of what it used to be just not that long ago. And what this has allowed to happen is, if you have an idea for a product, it can be built. Technology is no longer the defensible moat that it used to be. In years past, just building a product could be necessary and sufficient because no one else could build it. It was that hard and that expensive to do things. Today, building a product, it's certainly necessary. It is by no means sufficient because very quickly, other people can build a similar product, maybe even a better product, and they can do it faster and cheaper than you can possibly predict. And that's a really intriguing trend that's happened that's made entrepreneurship both super exciting because it's made it accessible to a lot of people, but also very difficult because of how competitive and crowded it is. So that's one trend that we've seen. Next slide. Now, everyone talks about how hard it is to get consumer traction, but I just wanted to illustrate that with two screenshots of the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. So this first slide is the Apple App Store, and the next slide will show is the Google Play Store. But if you look at this, what you'll see is that it's dominated by two things. One is incumbent apps, YouTube, Facebook, Messenger, Pandora, Uber, Spotify. I mean, big, massive incumbent apps dominated. The other thing that's dominated by is games. And games are largely pay to play in terms of getting on this chart. Becoming a top app, the games buy installs. So because of that, it's just really hard for a non-game and a non-incumbent to get any sustained distribution through the App Store. This is an example of the Apple App Store. So let's look at the next slide, which is the Google Play Store, and you see the exact same trend. You see that it's dominated by incumbents and it's dominated by games. Those are the two categories of apps that get distribution through the App Store, through these top charts, where a lot of people go to find out what to install. So why is that? Why is there so little movement? Why is distribution now so hard, as measured by these two screenshots of the App Store? Well, we believe that there's really two reasons for that. The first is that mobile, and in many ways, the web platform, they are now getting quite mature. And what I mean by that is that the low-hanging problems, a lot of them have been solved and solved pretty sufficiently. So 10 years ago, taking and sharing a photo was really, really hard. It was cumbersome for the user. Getting directions to a coffee shop, well, first finding the coffee shop and then getting directions to that coffee shop was actually really hard 10 years ago. Finding a piece of video to watch and getting to consume it on the go, on demand, was really, really hard 10 years ago. Today, those problems are pretty well solved. Yes, maybe they could be a little bit better, but we're talking about thinking of single percentage points improvements in those problems that you encounter every day. As opposed to 10 years ago, you're talking about order of magnitude improvements that you could create through technology. So platforms are mature, and there are what we call good enough solutions everywhere. So that's one reason why we think that consumer traction is hard. The other reason is that these incumbents that we see today, they are some of the smartest and best companies I think that have ever existed. It's hard to imagine someone sneaking up on Google or sneaking up on Amazon or sneaking up on Facebook and surprising them. It's just really hard. These entrepreneurs that founded these companies and the executives that they brought in and the teams and the data and how nimble and fast they are, it's something that we've never seen before in terms of the dominant position. So because of that, the incumbents now are very careful about upstarts. When they see something, they can go directly compete with it, or maybe they go acquire it before it has a chance to get to scale. But because of that, it's really hard to imagine someone sneaking up on one of these companies. So when you add those two things together, dominant incumbents that are really smart, plus not kind of a dearth of low-hanging, simple problems to go off and solve, it just makes creating a solution that can get consumer traction really, really hard. So what does that mean? Should we all just kind of hang up, maybe just go focus on enterprise stuff, like find other careers to do, other lines of work? Thankfully, no, because there's still a ton to be excited about, and I see amazing startups every day, and wanted to share now a couple of interesting trends that we've been seeing. So next slide. So here are 3 trends that I've been really focusing on Kleiner Perkins and that we've been seeing in the industry. And I'm going to share some stats from my partner Mary Meeker's Internet Trends Report. How many folks here have read Mary Meeker's Internet Trends Report? Oh, not that many hands. It is an amazing report. You should definitely read it. There's actually a new version of that for 2016 coming out in just a couple of weeks. It'll blow your mind. It's amazing. But here are 3 trends that we've been observing very closely for the last 12 to 24 months. The first is around urbanization. So when you bring people together in denser and denser pockets, you create interesting networks and interesting density that can allow new businesses and new services to emerge. So that's one. Second, millennials. Everyone's terrified of millennials. Millennials are taking over the world. You know, we're doomed because it's all about the millennials. But what's really interesting is that millennials have very different consumption behaviors that create new business opportunities. And we'll get into that in a second. And last is there are still interesting interaction models that are being created every day that we think can launch brand new startups and businesses as well. So why don't we start with urbanization? This is a slide from Mary's report. And what you can see is that there's a massive shift towards urbanization that's been happening over the last 100 years, and it's sustaining. It's not a blip. It's not a trend like, hey, everyone kind of moved to the city as a fad, but 2 years from now, that's going to go away. This is a dominant, here-to-stay change of consumer behavior, change of living behavior, and it's even more pronounced. The curve of change is even more pronounced outside the U.S. But because we are now more urban and we now have greater urban density, this allows us to do a lot of things like the next slide around on-demand services as an example for how to take advantage of urban density. So now there are tons of amazing on-demand services that fulfill almost every need within about an hour. Here are all examples of things that you can do in about an hour. Pretty amazing. So this is one example of how a shift in living behavior towards more urban, dense environments has created brand new business opportunities for great consumer companies. And there are going to be a lot more. As urban density continues to increase, there's going to be other business opportunities that follow along. Next slide. So now let's get into millennials. So people think of millennials as this big demographic, which it is. Huge demographic in the United States. And we define millennials as people roughly between the ages of 15 and 35. But more excitingly, millennials are actually the single largest workforce in the United States. Workforce. So not only are they a big demographic, but they're a demographic with buying power. So you got these new people with different ways of thinking that have buying power. Pretty potent. And what are they doing differently? Well, let's look at the next slide as an example. They consume media very differently. So millennials consume about 3 times as much media on demand than through linear models like television. So instead of watching just live TV linearly, they prefer to watch things on demand. That's the chart on the left. Look at the chart on the right. An exciting thing about millennials, too, is that the people they find influential are very different. On the right is this thing called the Q score that Variety puts out every year, targeted at teenagers to find out which celebrities influence them. And if you look at this, there's only 3 traditional media celebrities in the top 12. The other 9 are new media celebrities, people that have emerged on Vine and Instagram and YouTube. People like Ryan Higa and PewDiePie, and probably names that a lot of people in this room don't even know, but they're incredibly influential. So this is an interesting new phenomenon that if you see how millennials are consuming differently, you could create new services that target them. Things that provide media on demand. Things that provide mattresses sent through the mail, like Casper. You can imagine 10 years from now, a millennial will never have gone into a mattress warehouse. They'll never have gone into a mattress store. They'll only have purchases through a new brand like Casper. So millennials consume things differently, such as media, and that creates new interesting opportunities. And then the last example that I'll give is around new user interfaces. So as I mentioned, there are now good enough solutions for most of the low-hanging problems out there. And what this has created is that in order to get any consumer adoption, good enough is no longer good enough. You have to be better enough. That's what we call it. You have to be better enough. You can't just kind of like half-ass it because it was so broken before that consumers will accept any solution. That's no longer the case. I think you have to focus on better enough solutions. And an example of that in this next slide is around voice-controlled conversational interfaces. So look at what used to be acceptable in the world of controlling your media. Having 12 remote controls that with terrible user interfaces and these terrible displays that you had to navigate through in a very cumbersome way, that's no longer good enough. We're looking for better enough. And better enough are things like Alexa, when you can actually just talk to your media agent. So this is an example of applying technology in a really interesting, innovative way around new interfaces, which we think is still a huge opportunity. So I just wanted to point out 3 trends that we're super excited by at Kleiner, and leave you with one last thing, which is that there is truly no greater rewarding professional experience than starting companies and going along your entrepreneurial journey. I've vacillated between being an entrepreneur myself to being an investor working with entrepreneurs, but I think the key trend through all of that is just my love of spending time with great startups and great founders. I think that is so rewarding, and I'm super excited to continue to do that, and I hope that I have a chance to work with all of you today. And again, thank you very much for taking the time here today.